Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tuning into something many of us use pretty much daily, Spotify.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
We're going to explore how this leading audio streaming platform uses market research to really dial in those music recommendations and, the whole experience you have with the app.
That's right. We've been digging into a really interesting article from Cognitive Market Research. It just came out, actually, May 10th, 2025.
Oh, fresh off the press then.
Pretty much. And it really gives us a peek behind the curtain at how Spotify strategically uses user data and all sorts of research methods.
Okay, so our mission here is to unpack how Spotify takes all that raw data and user feedback and somehow turns it into a platform that feels like it gets you, musically at least. We want to understand how a tech leader like this stays ahead by truly figuring out what makes its users tick. Okay, so let's jump in. How does Spotify make those music recommendations feel so personal? It's got to be more than just counting plays, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's way beyond just tracking play counts. What's fascinating, and what the article really highlights, is their comprehensive approach.
How so?
They use basically everything. User surveys, focus groups, really deep dives into behavioral analysis, and just constant A/B testing.
A/B testing, like trying different versions of things.
Exactly. Showing different users slightly different features or layouts to see what works best. All this lets them understand the subtle nuances of how we actually engage with music and what our preferences really are.
So it's quite granular then.
Very. Like, their behavioral analysis might show that if you skip the first few seconds of the song but then come back and save it later, well, they see that pattern.
Like you're testing the waters.
Precisely. And their algorithms now actually consider that kind of behavior.
That's pretty clever. It almost feels like they're reading our minds, even when we aren't sure ourselves. I mean, take Discover Weekly, that playlist.
Yeah.
Wow. It often throws up stuff I didn't even know existed, let alone that I'd like.
Right.
How did that specific feature come about? Was it just a lucky guess?
No, not at all. Discover Weekly is actually a perfect example of research directly leading to a major feature. The article points out it came from this core user insight.
Which was?
Well, that people generally want to find new music.
Yeah, most people do.
But, we also tend to just stick with what we already know and like. Creatures of habit.
True. There's a comfort level there.
So Spotify saw this sort of tension, this gap, and figured they could bridge it, offer personalized discovery, but in a way that feels, I guess, familiar and not too overwhelming.
So it wasn't just some music guru hidden away making these lists. It was actual, data and research driving it.
Precisely. The algorithm behind Discover Weekly, it's actually a pretty sophisticated blend of different techniques.
Like what?
Well, it uses collaborative filtering. That's kind of like how Amazon suggests products based on what other people with similar tastes bought.
Okay, makes sense. Based on listening habits.
Exactly. But it also uses natural language processing, or NLP, that looks at all the text and metadata around the music reviews, articles, lyrics maybe. And on top of that, audio analysis, actually dissecting the sound itself, the tempo, the energy, the mood, the instrumentation, almost like the ingredients of the song.
Wow. Okay. That sounds incredibly complex. And didn't Spotify buy a company a while back? Something about music intelligence.
You're spot on. Yeah, the 2014 acquisition of the Echo Nest, that was a huge deal for them, a real game changer.
Why was it so significant?
They brought this massive amount of, music intelligence data and analysis capability, going way beyond simple genre tags to look at tempo, cultural context, even the sort of emotional feel of a song.
So recommendations could get much more nuanced, not just, you like rock, here's more rock.
Exactly. It allowed Spotify to make recommendations based on a much, much richer understanding of the music itself layered on top of your listening patterns.
And it's not static, right?
Okay.
Our actions skipping songs, adding to playlists that all feeds back in.
Absolutely. It's a constant feedback loop. Every time you skip, save, add to a playlist, share. That's all data.
Giving this system clues.
Precisely. It continuously refines the recommendations, making sure they stay relevant as your tastes, evolve over time.
Okay, so they've clearly put a ton of effort into the recommendations. But the app itself, the look and feel, that's changed quite a bit too over the years.
Yeah.
What did research tell them about the user interface, the UI?
Yeah, that's crucial too. I mean, you can have the best recommendations in the world, but if the app is clunky or confusing,
We'll stick around to hear them.
exactly. So their UI redesigns have been heavily influenced by research into user behavior, specifically looking for those little stumbling blocks, those friction points that just make things annoying or difficult.
What kind of friction points? What were people struggling with?
The article mentions things like wanting faster access to their music and podcasts and controls that just felt more, well, intuitive, easier to use without thinking.
So how did they figure out how to fix that?
They used a mix of methods. Ethnographic studies were one.
What does that involve? Sounds fancy.
It's basically researchers observing people using Spotify in their actual lives, like watching someone use it on their commute or while cooking or working out, seeing the real-world context.
Ah, seeing the real struggles.
Yeah. Plus, traditional usability tests in labs and analyzing real-time data flowing from the app itself where people tap, where they get stuck.
I definitely remember the app used to be way more text-heavy. Now it's very visual, lots of big album art. Was that a conscious shift based on this research?
Oh, absolutely deliberate. Research clearly showed that users, especially on mobile screens, responded much better to visual cues.
Makes sense. Quicker to scan.
Right. Album artwork, imagery that suggests a mood. It's much faster to process than lines of text.
Yeah.
That led directly to the sort of card-based layout we see now. Makes discovering stuff easier and quicker.
And the home feed too, right? Those tiles that change based on what I listen to.
Yep, that's another outcome. Dynamic tiles, personalized to your recent activity, time of day, things like that, all driven by understanding user habits.
And I've noticed the navigation at the bottom seems simpler now. I remember feeling like there were menus hidden all over the place before.
Exactly. That's another piece of feedback. Users sometimes felt overwhelmed by just the sheer number of options and menus.
Information overload?
Kind of. So they simplified that bottom navigation bar, consolidated some menus, and even introduced those little helpful prompts sometimes. You know, the ones that guide you through a new feature.
Ah, yeah, those little pop-ups.
It's all about making the app feel less cluttered, more intuitive, easier to just use.
It really sounds like they're thinking about the whole journey, you know?
Yeah.
From the moment you open the app to finding something new, not just hitting play.
That's a really key insight from the research, yes. Spotify focuses on personalizing the entire user lifecycle, right from when you first sign up through to your daily engagement.
How do they manage that? Surely everyone uses it differently.
Well, that's where segmentation comes in. Their studies identify different types of listeners. You've got your, say, casual listeners just putting on playlists.
Right.
Then the real audiophiles, maybe podcast devotees, people who love exploring specific genres. Each group has slightly different needs and behaviors.
So my experience when I first sign up might be tailored differently than someone who's been using Spotify for years.
Precisely. Research showed that new users could get frustrated trying to build up a listening history quickly.
Yeah, that cold start problem.
Exactly. So they introduced things like onboarding quizzes, asking about your favorite artists, and more dynamic setup flows. The aim is to build you a personalized library faster, make those first interactions feel good so you're more likely to stick around.
And what about long-term users, power users?
For those users, based on their usage data and maybe specific surveys, Spotify might offer more advanced features or different kinds of recommendations. It adapts.
It seems like it's not just about clicks and skips either.
Mm-hmm.
Are they trying to gauge like how we feel about the music or the platform?
They are, actually. That's where things like sentiment analysis and social listening come into play.
How does that work?
They analyze, often anonymously and in aggregate, things like comments, social media mentions, maybe even support interactions to understand the emotional responses people have to certain content, playlists, or even their ad campaigns.
To make sure the vibe is right.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay.
To make sure the tone of the platform resonates, to understand if a new feature is sparking joy or frustration. It helps them build a stronger sort of relationship with users, like a brand checking if people are happy or annoyed about a new product.
And Spotify's obviously moved beyond just music now. Podcasts are huge. They're getting into audiobooks. Did research guide those moves too?
Oh, massively. Market research was absolutely vital for identifying those growth areas.
How so for podcasts?
Surveys and time use studies, basically looking at how people spend their listening time, clearly showed the rising popularity of podcasts, especially with certain groups. That directly informed their big investments in podcasting, creating a dedicated section in the app. improving playback controls, personalized podcast recommendations.
And buying podcast companies.
Right. Acquisitions like Anchor and Megaphone were also about understanding and serving the needs of podcast creators, which is another side of the market they researched.
Makes sense. What about audiobooks? That feels like a pretty natural fit.
It does. And again, research pointed the way. Studies into the habits of, say, busy commuters or people who like to multitask suggested a demand for audiobooks.
People short on time.
Exactly. So Spotify didn't just jump in. They ran trial programs, gathered user feedback on pricing models, features, the catalog, really trying to fine-tune the offering based on what potential listeners said they wanted.
It's just incredible how much data seems to underpin every single decision. But the article mentioned something about balancing all this data with, like, ethical design. How do they manage that?
Yeah, that's a really important aspect they seem to be focusing on. It's not just about optimizing metrics. They emphasize using qualitative research, too, like in-depth user interviews, to really understand the human side of the experience.
What kind of issues come up there?
Well, concerns about things like algorithmic bias, maybe feeling trapped in a filter bubble, or just getting, notification fatigue.
Right, too many alerts or autoplay starting something you didn't want.
Exactly. Research identified those kinds of pain points. And that feedback led directly to things like more customizable notification settings, opt-in features like enhance for playlists, giving users more control.
So it's not just pushing things at you based on data, it's also about pulling back sometimes.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
They also talk about transparency publishing information about how their algorithms generally work, trying to build user trust.
That's good. And are they thinking about diversity in recommendations too, making sure it's not all just the same type of stuff?
Yes, the article mentions they conduct specific audits of their content recommendations. They use cultural research and feedback from different communities to try and ensure that personalization doesn't accidentally end up hiding artists from underrepresented backgrounds.
So trying to promote discovery in a broader sense too.
That seems to be the goal, yeah. A platform that feels personal, but also open and equitable.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. The article dropped a pretty eye-popping statistic, a fast fact.
Yeah. The Discover Weekly playlist. We talk about how it came from research.
Right.
Well, when it launched back in 2015, after all that groundwork, it attracted over 40 million users in its first year.
Wow. 40 million.
And at this, those users streamed nearly 5 billion tracks just from those playlists in that first year.
5 billion.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It really shows the power of getting that personalization right, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It underlines just how impactful understanding user needs and desires can be.
So really, to wrap this all up, Spotify's success in giving us these personalized audio experiences, it's not just luck or a massive catalog. It seems deeply, deeply rooted in this continuous comprehensive market research.
Constantly listening, analyzing, testing.
They're always trying to understand us, the listeners, better. And that understanding is what fuels their innovation, how the platform keeps changing and evolving.
Definitely. By consistently tuning into user behavior and feedback, both quantitative and qualitative, Spotify really demonstrates how that deep user understanding becomes a massive strategic advantage, especially in such a competitive space.
It really makes you think. Considering how Spotify uses your listening habits, my listening habits, to shape our experience, it leads to a bigger question, doesn't it?
Like what?
Well, what other parts of our digital lives do you think could benefit from this really intense level of user-centric research and personalization? And maybe more importantly, what are the potential downsides or implications of that?
That's a really interesting thought to chew on. Where else could this be applied, and what does it mean for us?
Definitely something to consider. Thanks for this really fascinating deep dive today.
My pleasure. Lots to think about.